The eighth key idea of the worldview of the Christian faith is that when a person submits to God or reverses the act of rejection and receives God's grace and forgiveness and entrusts their life to God, then God enters that person's life through His Holy Spirit. In other words, the change that takes place in a person is not only in intellectual belief, it's not only in the experience of forgiveness, but the Spirit of God actually enters the person's life to begin the process of inner change and renewal. There is a change takes place at the very core of a person's being. That is the claim the Christian faith makes. And that change is to constantly remind us of God's presence and to encourage and empower us to work for the restoration of the world to God's original intention for it. We are radically renewed at the core of our being by the Spirit of God. The ninth key idea: Christ rose from the dead. And in that event of the exercise of His absolute power, God not only restored Christ to His former glory, but He began the process of the deliverance of the whole creation from entropy, decay and disease. And this process will conclude when Christ returns at the conclusion of human history as we presently experience it. And the 10th and the final key idea: everyone will ultimately be held accountable before God for their decisions, their thoughts and their actions. So these are the main features of the Christian worldview. Now in a moment we're going to have a break for some discussion, and then in the next session we'll look at some of the problems and the difficulties that arise out of pluralism and relativism, for which it has few satisfactory answers itself. But on the other hand, our Christianity and the Christian worldview has far more reasonable, hopeful and fulfilling answers. Let's break now for discussion. Well, in this session we're going to look at some of the problems and the issues that pluralism and perspectivism and moral relativism fail to address adequately, and for which Christianity, I think, has significant answers. I guess the first major issue that arises is the whole question of morals and ethics and how you make choices about things if you come from a pluralist perspective. If everything is just a matter of personal perspective, what is the foundation for moral and ethical choice? How do we determine what's right and wrong? Some of you may have heard of a character called Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a 19th century philosopher, a German philosopher. And it was Nietzsche who anticipated the loss of belief in God in European culture. Now, Nietzsche himself didn't believe in God, but he said that if God died, that is, the idea of belief in God died in the mind of Western culture, then people must become and be all that God had been for people before. In other words, people would have to decide what was right and wrong. People would have to determine what the ultimate purpose of life was, and so on. People would have to make up their own moral standards. They would have to determine what the moral compass point was for choice, and so on. Now, Nietzsche was right. That is the logical conclusion. And the French existentialists that followed Nietzsche took that to its logical conclusion. And so here's a quotation from Sartre. He says, "We are left alone without excuse, condemned to be free." That is, free to create our own values, our own basis for moral decisions. There's no one else out there to decide for us. It's up to the individual. So that's the first problem that's raised by pluralism and perspectivism. The second one is the whole question of the reality of evil. Now, no one can have lived in any part of the 20th century, let alone the 21st, without having become aware of the enormity of evil in our world. When you think of the terrible things that have been done, the killing fields of Kampuchea, the Holocaust, the death camps in Stalin's Russia, we could go on and on. Now, what is the origin of this heart of darkness? Where does it come from? And the very fact that we recognise it and are appalled by it as evil, and yet at the same time are its perpetrators, is a puzzle, is it not? Now, should it be judged? Should it be called to account, this evil? And by whom? And by what standard? Os Guinness has said, face to face with raw and naked human evil, relativism and hyper-tolerance collapses. Absolute evil calls for absolute judgment. But if you live in a pluralist, perspectivist, relativist world, there is no such thing as absolute judgment. So there's a great moral contradiction there. And pluralists themselves are caught in this moral contradiction. It's they themselves who say these truths are self-evident, that all people should be treated equal and so on. And yet, we do not treat people equally. We are the perpetrators of the evil that we ourselves identify and appalled by. So the question arises, how do we deal with this in ourselves, for a start, let alone in society and in the international community? Now, one of our attempts, and the attempts of those who came from a kind of humanist perspective in the past, have been, well, education is the answer, or psychology is the answer, or social engineering, or raising the general prosperity of the community is the answer. We have tried all these things, but none of them has banished the reality of evil. Government legislation. None of these things have done the trick. So the question of the reality of evil hangs there as a major problem for those who would come from a pluralist or perspectivist point of view. The third problem is the question of forgiveness and redemption. Where do I go to be forgiven? For example, if the person I have harmed is dead, who forgives me? Or if the person I have harmed will not forgive me, where do I go for forgiveness? Or if the thing that I need forgiveness from or for is not related to other people but is something deep inside myself, where do I go?